So Diana, you're from Pittsburgh, Kansas. Can you tell me a little bit about what it was like growing up in the 1950s?
Yes, the 50s and 60s. I was born in 1950, halfway through the century, in southeast Kansas, Pittsburgh. It was a great place to grow up because it's a college town like Lawrence, and I
Mhm.
lived 4 blocks from the campus. My 3 of my 4 grandparents were immigrants, 2 from Italy, 1 from Belgium. And then my paternal grandmother was born in the U.S., but her parents had immigrated from Italy. And there were like 22 nationality groups that settled down there, including Lebanese Christians. So, my friend's mother, was making hummus and pita and kibbeh and all this stuff before anybody else knew what this was. So I grew up with all this incredible international food. I was used to accents and foreign languages. And, it was just a great place to grow up because we had all of the culture from the university. I mean, I saw my first opera in Pittsburgh, Kansas, not in New York.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
At a young age?
It was in high school. It
Okay.
was a Mall and the Night Visitors. And, I saw music groups come in. We had lecturers. So I really grew up in a wonderful cultural environment from many directions. And then I went to high school on the campus. That was back when they had laboratory high schools. They used to
Oh,
have them
okay.
with KU. It was a way of giving education majors a chance to practice and be taught by people who actually were teaching the students. So methods classes were taught by people who were in the education department, and they taught in our high school. So I had like a PhD teaching me
Oh wow!
freshman science. We had a PhD who taught some of the math classes. So it was just a wonderful environment. And that's probably what got me hooked on education.
And I know I heard in a different podcast that you were on that you got interested into like politics and like first ladies like through your library, like reading the biographies and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
yes, I have been a bibliophile my entire life. My mother, read to me the number of pictures I have of me as a little kid with books. I have one of me sitting in front. I had a tent that I'd be in the summers, and I'm sitting in front of the tent with a book, and I'm about 2.
Hmm.
So I've loved books, but there was a set of biographies in my elementary school library that was just about women, and I read every one of them. And Abigail Adams was one, Martha Washington was one, and that just really hooked me. And then when I was in high school, well, actually, when I was still in elementary school, middle school, I guess it would have been 7th, 8th grade, Jackie Kennedy was first lady. And everybody, of course, was enthralled with her. I was like 10, 11 years old. And I remember watching the tour of the White House. And then I dreamt that night that Abraham Lincoln was standing by my bed. But, she was so elegant and did so much. And then I was in high school debate and competitive speech, and I did extemporaneous speaking, which is where you draw 3 topics, you pick one, you have 30 minutes to write a speech, practice it, then go give it with a note card or no notes at all. And Lady Bird Johnson was first lady then. And she was doing all this environmental work. She was really an activist. So I would get topics about Lady Bird and her beautification program. So that just kind of got me, really interested in what these women were doing. And then when I started teaching at KU, I brought that love of first ladies to a class, excuse me, that I taught on women in politics. And my students loved it, and they said, we want more of this. So I created a special topics 1 semester course. That was my last semester at KU before I, quote, retired and then went to St. Louis University for a while.
Okay. And when you were growing up during this time, were your like parents pushing you to like get into this stuff like politics and
Oh,
was it like
actually,
talked at like at the dinner table?
oh, yeah, we talked politics all the time. My mother was a precinct committee woman, and then she also worked at on the election board. So I remember election day. My dad couldn't get involved in politics because he was a federal employee,
Oh, okay.
but all of his friends were. So he had friends who were running for office, and so I knew these people, and my grandparents lived next door to the aunt and uncle of our congressman.
Oh wow.
So we'd be in my grandparents' backyard, and the congressman would show up. And so he had been a debater and a debate coach. So anything I needed in the way of a government hearing, or I would just write to him and he'd send it to me. And so, like I said, my mother worked on the election board. My dad would take the day off. He would get us ready to go to school. And then he would go take my grandparents, who did not have a car and didn't drive, to vote. And then he waited to vote until we all got out of school. And then we would take like a sack lunch to my mother, and my dad would vote, and they'd have like a sample ballot. And he'd give each of us one so that we could vote. So it was like kids voting, which was a project I was involved in for many years. So yes, politics was huge. It was interesting because we had competing parties and philosophies in the family. And so I can remember listening, especially to my great uncle and my uncle, who were both union members. And the great uncle's son was an entrepreneur and owned factories in Ohio. He was a K-State engineering major, and his employees were not unionized.
Mm-hmm.
So I can remember these, discussions among the three of them at holidays. So yeah, I grew up around it, and then being a debater, you really get into it.
And did you watch the first televised debate? I think that was with Kennedy and Nixon.
I remember I was 10 years old, and I remember the one that was on a Friday night. And I watched part of it, but then I was waiting for the neighbors, and we were going to a football game because Friday night. So I watched snippets of it because my parents did, but 10-year-old not. But I do remember, little bits of watching that debate. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say, like, once you're like graduating college, like, what would you say, like, you wanted to actually do? Like, did you want to go into politics? Did you always want to go into education?
Yeah, I always wanted to go into education. Yeah, I never really wanted to run for office, especially, as politics got crazier, but I loved following it. And I remember in 1964, I would have been 14 and a freshman in high school. And one of our assignments in our social studies class was to go down to both headquarters, Republican and Democrat, and get information. But I remember during the summer, I watched every minute of both the Republican and Democrat conventions because my parents always watched them. And I kept a notebook, and I don't know whatever happened to that, but I took notes and the speeches. And of course, that was the year I started taking speech and debate. And so, yeah, I've followed it closely. And the very first paper I ever wrote on political debates was my sophomore year at KU. And at that point, the only debates we had were the Kennedy-Nixon, because that was in the late 60s, early 70s, and it wasn't until 76 that we had another presidential debate. We went from 1960 to 1976 without presidential debates. So I wrote this final paper kind of comparing the content of what viewers could get from political ads versus debates. And that's kind of what got me hooked on studying presidential debates.
Mm-hmm. So you said you got interested in presidential debates and covering those. What got you into like the First Lady part after that?
Well, it was teaching courses at KU in women in politics.
Okay.
I come from a family of 4 girls. And like I said, I read all these women's biographies. And it was at a time when, women were starting to get involved in politics. And of course, Nancy Kassebaum, who just passed away, who I did know, and I really considered her a friend. I met her on multiple occasions, and we've exchanged letters and phone calls over the years. She ran for the Senate in 1978, and I was still teaching high school back then. And, she was the only woman in the Senate for 2 years. And so that just really intrigued me. And she was such an incredible role model. And then Martha Keyes was elected to Congress from Kansas. So there were these women, and, they did make a difference. And that was pretty easy to see. And I remember at one of the Republican conventions, Margaret Chase Smith, who had been in the U.S. Senate, she was like a favorite daughter nominee for president at one of the conventions. So I'd always been intrigued by the role of women, just coming from a family where we were taught to be strong women. Like, you can do anything a guy can do, just put your mind to it.
Mm-hmm.
So these women just always fascinated me. And by the time I was teaching at KU in the late 80s, early 90s, there were more and more women who were getting into politics. So there was a critical mass to study at that point. There was beginning to be research done on women and what the differences were. So I was really kind of an early adopter of that particular area of political communication.
And like, did you see a big shift in like people's thinking once women are going into politics? Like, especially like in, I don't know, men or like the media, are they like talking good about it, bad about it?
Well, it's still a mixed bag. Once you began having a few women elected, then it became a little more natural. I co-authored a book called Gender in the American Presidency, and Nancy Kassebaum gave me a long interview for it. And then I also interviewed Kathleen Sebelius. And, one of the things, I think it was Kathleen who said it, it's hard to imagine something you haven't seen. So when we finally have Nancy Kassebaum in the Senate, you have a Martha Keyes, and you have all these other women, and there were several women governors by that time, some up in the Northwest, there were some in the Northeast. So when Ella Grasso, I remember Dixie Ray. So when I was in college, then you began to see some women governors. And they do govern differently, and there's a lot of research that shows that. They tend to bring in a wider variety of people that they listen to. They tend to be more collaborative, more bipartisan. And that was one of Nancy Kassebaum's chief, attributes, was that she worked with Teddy Kennedy, who was one of the most liberal senators we've ever had. And she said, some people in Kansas think you're like a witch. I mean, that was one of her quotations. She said, they go, how can you work with that man? But they did, and because they had similar goals for their constituents. So you did see women reaching across the aisle a lot more. They often stood up when men wouldn't, like Margaret Chase Smith. Unbelievable. During the McCarthy era, McCarthy, everybody knows about the McCarthy and the communist, looking for communists under every rock. Margaret Chase Smith gave a speech on the Senate floor and took him to task. Oh. And nobody else had done it. You should look that speech up.
I have to.
Yeah, it's is it a call to conscience or something like that?
Okay.
It's an incredible speech. And that was one I had studied in one of my graduate classes. And so, women some of the time will take those risks that men didn't. I've done a lot of research on the media treatment of women. I co-authored an article after 2008 because we had Sarah Palin, vice president, and then, of course, Hillary had run in the primaries with one of my graduate students, Kelly Winfrey, who's at Iowa State. And we looked at, I don't know how many newspapers, we looked at television news, we looked at the way they covered Hillary versus the men in the primary, we looked at the way they were written about. And then, Kathleen Sebelius, when I interviewed her for this book, talked about, some of the sexism in the way she was covered. Give an example, she was in a debate, and she was the only woman, obviously, for governor. And she had a pair of peep-toe shoes, it shows part of your toes. Mm-hmm. And the reporter wrote about her peep-toe shoes and the color of her nail polish.
Instead of the debate.
And then he got to the debate, but talked about her, her clothes. And she said her press secretary called him up, and I have this is in the book, and said, "You have daughters, don't you? And if your daughter was running for office, would you want the press talking about how she looks as opposed to what she believes in and says?" And it was like, okay, he never did anything like that again. But I remember when Nancy Pelosi became speaker, a few weeks after she was speaker, there was this collage of photos of her neck with all the different pearls she had worn. Okay. So she had like 8 different strands or necklaces with pearls. Mm-hmm. She's the first woman Speaker of the House, and we're writing about her pearls. And that didn't end until there was... So Kelly and I wrote this article after the 2008, and the sexism was both ways. And then we went back to to 2020, and we did an update of it because we had so many women on the Democrat side who ran in the primary, and then Kamala Harris running in the, becoming the first woman vice president.
Mm-hmm.
And we found that not a whole lot had changed in the way the media was talking about women. And so they asked different questions. There's a lot more about the family. There was one race with 2 women in Oklahoma that I remember writing about. One of them had never been married. So the woman who was married and had children said the one who had never been married really wasn't qualified to be governor because she'd never been a mother and didn't understand really family issues. So it kind of cuts a bunch of different directions. And, those articles of ours have, been read worldwide. The first one we wrote, the journal is almost probably 90 years old.
Oh,
and I
wow.
think it's still the second most downloaded and read article out of that whole journal. And it got me an invitation to Mexico City several years ago
Mm-hmm.
to speak at an international conference on women in politics. And, we still have a lot of sexism. Polls will say that the American public is ready for a woman president, but then when it's time to actually, pull the ballot, it doesn't happen. Even though Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but still, we're still not there. And there have been, 80, 90 women going all the way back to 1961 in Sri Lanka,
Mm-hmm.
where we had the first woman prime minister, and we still haven't done it except for VP.
And did you see this kind of sexism as well, like in your research, like even dating back to like the start of the country, like with Martha Washington?
Oh, yeah, there's been sexism from the beginning. Well, the title of our book on First Ladies is Remember the First Ladies. We unashamedly stole that from Abigail Adams in a letter she wrote on March 31st, 1776 to John. This is before the Declaration, when he's off, in Philadelphia trying to decide how to start this country.
Mm-hmm.
And she wrote to him, when you form this new country, remember the ladies. Do not be tyrants like all men would be. And then she goes off on a rant. And what she was talking about was something called coverture. It's overture with a C, coverture. And it's a 12th century English common law idea that when a woman marries, she's covered by her husband, so she doesn't need to have any rights. She gets the rights via her husband. So that meant women couldn't own property.
Mm-hmm.
They couldn't enter into contracts. I mean, if that's not discrimination, what
Mhm.
is? They couldn't divorce an abusive husband. If the husband divorced them, he got the children because they were his property. So she was basically property. And until she married, she was her father's property. So if she earned a wage, it went to her father, and he determined how much of it she got. So that's what Abigail was talking about. She wasn't talking about voting. It's misinterpreted, but it's like
Okay.
we are treated as non-people in some ways. We no longer, and it's why Susan B. Anthony never married. She said, a woman who married was civilly dead,
Oh,
had
wow.
no rights. So yeah, it goes back way to the 12th century common law
Mhm.
that our government was based on in terms of women.
Okay. And like starting with like the woman that you covered, who was like your favorite one that you covered?
Of the first ladies?
Yeah, of the first ladies.
Yeah, everybody asks me that, and I gave kind of a flippant response at one one program. And I said, whoever I was writing about at the time. And there's actually a little truth to that, because once we began digging in, it took us 3 years to write these books. There are actually 2 books. We started with a textbook, because when I taught these courses at KU, I didn't have a textbook. There were a lot of individual biographies, and I have to do a shout out to the University Press of Kansas. They have been the leader in books about first ladies.
Okay.
And it took a man to start it, because if a woman had tried to say, I'm going to spend my time writing about women, I had trouble getting articles about first ladies accepted.
Oh.
And the woman I'm co-authoring a Betty Ford biography for the University Press of Kansas right now, when she told her dissertation committee she wanted to write about first ladies, they said, why would you do that? They aren't important. What is there even enough for a dissertation? So that was the attitude in academia. But there was a man at the University of Texas, Louis L. Gould, who, when the Johnson Library opened, Lady Bird has an apartment there, which I actually had an opportunity to have lunch with her in her apartment
Oh,
for
wow.
2 hours. Yeah, that was just incredible. And he decided that he was going to invite her and he was going to teach a class on First Ladies, and she used to go to his class. So then he wrote a book for University Press of Kansas on Lady Bird Johnson and the environment. And to this day, it's the only book that's been written about a First Lady and an issue. And then they gave him a contract to start a series of biographies. So, we had all of those, but you can't use 20 biographies in a class. So I had to cobble together an article here, this, there, have the students go to biographies. So after I retired the second time, I got an email, and it was about the time COVID had started, from a publisher that I'd met at a conference I'd been in fall of 2019, and said, are you ready to write a textbook? You're retired now. Do you have some time? And pitch something. So I pitched a couple, and they came back and said, we're really interested in First Ladies because there are more courses, more units in like women's studies, political science, history, American studies. So they said, give us a little more detail. And so they offered me a contract. And I said, if I were to do this right, it would take me 10 years to research it and write it. So I need some co-authors. And they said, who do you have in mind? So I said, well, one of the people I have in mind is Nancy Keegan Smith, because we've written book chapters on Michelle Obama and Lady Bird Johnson together. So I know we can work together. And Nancy worked at the National Archives for 40 years. In fact, she got started at the LBJ Library and knew Mrs. Johnson. And I said, the other is Anita McBride, and she was Laura Bush's chief of staff. Mm-hmm. And she's been writing in some of the same books we've been writing in. They said, oh, yeah, those are two well-qualified people. Mm-hmm. And so I went to them, and they said, we'll do it. Well, it took us 3 years to write the textbook. And then our editor was so intrigued. She kept saying, when's the next chapter coming? And she told us, she said, most of the textbooks I have to edit are kind of boring. She said, but this is fascinating. Why didn't we learn this in history classes? And so she said, when you finish with the textbook, would you be willing to write what we call a trade book for the public? So that's how Remember the First Ladies came about. And if I hadn't taught that class at KU and hadn't been so frustrated, would have never happened. But that's so, when you have to write and research on all of them, you begin to realize that even the ones who didn't do a whole lot did something that was significant in that time. And if anybody's been at the Watkins Museum here in Lawrence, there is it's Searching for Freedom. And it's kind of Kansas in terms of the 250th. And there's a little area there with a picture of Sarah Robinson, who was the first Kansas First Lady with Governor Robinson in 1861, and Jane Pierce, who was First Lady in the 1850s. And I wrote that section because I had been asked, as a result of the research for Remember the First Ladies and then U.S. First Ladies, the textbook, found out that Jane Pierce impacted Kansas history. And I was invited to write the essay for a project called In Pursuit, which is a America 250 project of essays on presidents and selected first ladies. And they're 1,250 words. It's inpursuit.org. And every Tuesday since President's Day, when George W. Bush released the one on George Washington, they release the president on Tuesday. Then if there's an accompanying first lady, she's released on Thursday, and they're doing them chronologically. But Jane Pierce's aunt, her mother's sister, was the stepmother to the man Lawrence is named after.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And Jane was an abolitionist. Plus, Sarah Robinson was also related to Amos Adams Lawrence, who started the New Immigrant Aid Society, New England Immigrant Aid Society. So there were a group of abolitionists led by Dr. Robinson who Franklin Pierce imprisoned, was going to hang for sedition. Because they had they really were seditionists. Because after the Lecompton Constitution, and if you haven't been over to Lecompton, you should go over there, because that was a pro-slavery constitution. And it failed because the Missourians came over and stuffed the ballot box. Well, after that failed, a group of abolitionists held a constitutional convention in Topeka. And in fact, they've just kind of, I think, refurbished that hall. And they elected Robinson territorial governor, and they had the Topeka Constitution. Well, the whole point of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was that you'd have popular sovereignty, a popular vote to decide. So this was a seditious activity, and they were thrown in prison. And Jane Pierce was an abolitionist, and she had told her husband to not sign the Kansas-Nebraska Act because it would end in bloodshed. And she was absolutely right. So her aunt and Sarah Robinson intervened with her and said, we need to get these men out, or who knows what's going to happen to the abolition movement. So Jane went to Franklin Pierce and asked him to release them. And because he had so much respect for her Aunt Nancy, he did. And the rest is history. And the Robinsons gave the land for the University of Kansas. That was their land that the university's built on. So, it leads to the questions, if Jane Pierce had not done that, would KU be sitting on that hill?
Probably not.
Would we have been a free state?
Mm-mm.
But that's the only thing Jane Pierce really did, because 6 weeks before he was inaugurated, their last surviving child was killed in front of their eyes in a train wreck. It was the only fatality. And she went into deep mourning for 2 years and basically did nothing. But here was somebody who everybody had written off. And in fact, they were not even going to include her in the In Pursuit essays.
Oh, wow.
But Anita McBride, one of my co-authors, is one of the co-directors. And she said, no, you have to include Jane Pierce. And so I got to write that. So it's hard to pick a favorite. If I want to say who I think was probably the most successful, far-reaching, it has to be Eleanor Roosevelt. I think Lady Bird Johnson is right up there with her. There were several other first ladies who did some major things, but in terms of real activists, and of course Hillary Clinton, Michelle Obama, we have probably Betty Ford was phenomenal, and she only had 2.5 years. So there are probably 6 to 8 of these women who really were change makers.
And you think that was because the presidents like had a lot of respect for them, like maybe than the other presidents who aren't included in your list?
That is a great question. And one of the things we talk about in both our textbook and the trade book is how we trace the whole history of the position from Martha Washington to Melania. And we look at it from about 4 perspectives. One is the person's personal background. The second is what was going on during the times. How were women being treated during that period? A third one was the marriage itself. And a fourth one was sort of what was going on politically within the husband's administration. So yes, you are absolutely on target. These husbands knew how talented and politically savvy their wives were. And they knew that their wives could do things in a kind of nonpartisan way, less controversial, that would help what they were doing. And all of these women who were incredibly, successful and impactful, it was because their husbands gave them free rein. There were other women who could have just been amazing, but their husbands didn't let them. Grace Coolidge is a good example. She took on the traditional role of, more the hostess role, and he was not open. He was kind of shy. They called him Silent Kel because now he gave more radio addresses than FDR. So he wasn't silent as a politician, but interpersonally, he just wasn't very good. She, on the other hand, was incredible, and Grace was the perfect name for her. But he didn't want her to do anything that would make news. And he didn't really think women should be involved in politics, which is interesting because when he ran for vice president with Harding, that was the first time women could vote. Not all women, because Kansas women had been voting for 8 years. 17 states gave women full voting rights before 1920, but it was after the 19th Amendment. And so Grace voted, and there are pictures. at the Coolidge Historic Site of Grace voting
Mm-hmm.
as the first, after the 19th Amendment. But he just didn't think women belonged in politics. So she was really limited. And there have been other, husbands who limited because they just didn't, Nixon, for example. Pat Nixon was doing so much, but his advisors didn't want her getting media attention. So they just kind of restricted what was being done. So we've had women who did a lot, but because of the husbands, didn't get a lot of credit at the time.
And do you think like a lot of that outside influence, like how you're saying the advisors, do you think they play a large role, like speaking into the ear of the president or the first lady of what they can and cannot say?
Oh, absolutely. The West Wing controls a lot of what happens. And a really good example of that is Lady Bird Johnson, and we talk about that in our books. He gave her full reign, and he knew how savvy she was. But in 1964, he had signed the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, all of these, civil rights acts were passed. And the South was not happy with him. And he didn't think he'd win any of the southern states. He ended up winning, I think, either 3 or 4. But he could not campaign in the South. He knew he'd be booed, and they didn't think it was safe for him to be down there. Lady Bird's mother was from Alabama originally. Lady Bird grew up in Texas, East Texas, but her mother, and so she would spend summers because her mother died when Lady Bird was young. So she had spent a lot of time in the Deep South. And she said she would campaign for him. And she and her press secretary, Liz Carpenter, who was a great newswoman, they wanted to go do their own campaign trip, whistle-stop trip.
Mm-hmm.
And his advisor said no. So Liz, who had worked for LBJ, went in and said, we're going to do this. And LBJ went to his advisors and said, they're going to do this. You're not going to stop this. So, if Liz hadn't had that kind of relationship and if Lady Bird hadn't had, but when LBJ found out that his staff members didn't want her doing it, he just said, nope, she's going to do it. And these women planned the whole thing. And at the last stop in New Orleans, they started in Alexandria, Virginia, ended up in New Orleans, 17 stops along the way. They had to run an empty engine ahead of her train because there were death threats and bomb threats on the track. So they had to run this engine just in case to clear everything. And he came and joined her because she was beginning to have an impact. And originally, none of the Democrat politicians would join her on the back of the train. And as she went along and the crowds got bigger and it became more popular and she was getting great news, and suddenly these Democrat lawmakers were joining her. And that whistle-stop campaign was credited with helping him, win a few of, he didn't really need them given it was a landslide, but winning some of those southern states, Lady Bird did it.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, there have been other examples of where, some of these women were held back or they were pushed forward. There's another example we give in the book. This book is interesting because there are a lot of different types of books about First Ladies. They're individual biographies. There are a lot of edited books where somebody different wrote every chapter. And they tend to be either biographies, short biographies of all the First Ladies written by different people, and somebody edited it all. Some are thematic, like I have a chapter coming out in another University Press, a Kansas book, probably in the next 6 to 8 months, about First Ladies' memoirs. And I wrote the one on Julia Grant's memoir. And so you have these kind of thematic edited volumes. But this book is sort of a combination of biographical information and thematic chapters. So we have a thematic chapter on First Ladies as campaigners. And so, of course, Lady Bird and everybody else is in there.
Mm-hmm.
But one of our chapters is on communication. And we talk about speeches. And 4 speeches that were identified by communication scholars. I got the survey back in 1999. They sent it out to a couple hundred of us to list 10 of the top speeches of the 20th century. 4 of those were by First Ladies, 2 by Eleanor Roosevelt, 1 by Hillary Clinton, and 1 by Barbara Bush. George H.W. Bush, her husband, did not make the list.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't have a single speech on the list. But Hillary's speech was in Beijing, and that speech is still talked about because it was about human rights around the world and women. And she had to deal with the West Wing to do that speech. And we talk a lot about the politics between the East and West Wings before she gave that speech. And there were still some people who didn't want her going to Beijing. So your question was excellent because it's that relationship and the staffs having to get together. And Anita McBride, one of my co-authors, she was Laura Bush's chief of staff in the second term. And Anita had been working at the State Department and had been involved, this is after 9/11, had been involved with some Afghan women's issues. And Mrs. Bush had decided in the second term she wanted to go to Afghanistan. So she invited Anita in for an interview to be her chief of staff. And part of the reason she wanted her was that she wanted to go to Afghanistan. And Anita says that when Mrs. Bush said that, the first question Anita asked her was, what does the West Wing say about that? Because if they aren't on board, not going to happen. And they were on board. And they arranged a secret trip. Her first trip to Afghanistan was totally secret.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And what's the process of that? Like, how do they keep it secret? Like,
they kind of mislead as to what they're doing. They plan it all behind the scenes. You can always say, you're going someplace and you invite the press and it's like, guess where we're really going. Anita has talked about that at some of our book talks, but yeah, it was a lot of, and the presidents have gone places without anybody knowing where they were going until they got there. So they can keep things quiet from the press if they want to. And that first trip they did. Yeah.
And I know since you're mentioning Afghanistan, I know you said you've been to Kabul
5 times.
5 times to go set up like presidential debates at the universities or like teach them about it.
I did a couple projects. Yeah, I made 5 trips to Afghanistan over about a 3.5-year period. I'll never forget, I had gone once and I thought that would be it, but then the project was going so well. And I went back a second time, and it was right before I was going back the second time. My husband and I were at some social event. He was a Kansas Court of Appeals judge, so it was mainly lawyers. And it was like, well, is anybody traveling, And somebody was going somewhere, and they said, what about the 2 of you? And Joe goes, well, dear, tell them where you're going, in a month or whatever. And I said, well, I'm going to Afghanistan. And they go, are you serious? I said, yeah, this is my second trip. And this person turned to my husband and said, and you're letting her go? And he responded, as if I could stop her. And what I did was it was a grant to a non-governmental organization, an NGO called IFES, International Foundation for Electoral Systems. And they had originally done a lot of ballot watching for elections around the world. And then they began getting into more, once you have the elections and you've got to build a democracy, what kinds of things do people need? And one of the Afghan men who had lived outside of Afghanistan during the Taliban said, we need debate. They need to learn how to solve things with words and not guns. And we now have a parliament, and we've got to start training the young people. So he put in this grant proposal to start debate clubs in universities. And because I had done work for IFES in other countries, setting up political debates in the Republic of Georgia, and I advised in 2 or 3 other places, they knew I was an old debater and an old debate coach, and would I be interested in going over and starting British parliamentary debate clubs? So I, of course, said, of course I will. And I had been reading all of Hassan Khalini's books, Thousand Splendid Suns, Kite Runner. I'd read all of his books, and so I would get angry reading these books, what had been done to the women under the Taliban. And so I just immediately said, yes, I will do this. And so I ended up with 20 universities across the country who I taught the teachers first how you teach public speaking, how you teach debate, and then went into the schools in Kabul and then made videos that they could use every place else. And then we'd have a national tournament every year. And during one of those trips, I met with what was Tolo TV, which was their national television network, and began helping them develop presidential debates for their second presidential election, where Ghani was elected.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had our first meetings while I was in country, and some of the students who'd been in my project now had graduated and they were working for Tolo TV, and that's how they asked me if I would help. And then when I got back, I would be like on Skype calls. This was before Zoom. I was Skyping to Afghanistan at like 2 and 3 in the morning because it's a 13.5-hour time difference. And I helped them plan their presidential debates.
And when you're over there, like the first few times that you went, like were you well received by the people? Like what was their reactions to it?
It was that's a good question. It was a really interesting reaction because I wore a headscarf all the time and wore, either pants with a long tunic or I wore long skirts. And I had talked to some women at K-State who had gone over there teaching English because K-State was involved in a lot of agricultural programs, and I happened to know about what they were doing. And so they told me where I could buy clothes online and do some things. So, I had, you could tell some of the men were like not sure about this. And the fact that I came in, I learned some Dari, enough I could, be polite and practice my Dari. And of course, the armed guards who were at the house where I was staying, they were really pretty skeptical. But I had one student who asked me after I had kind of started teaching. He raised his hand and he said, "I have a question." I said, "Sure." He goes, "Why are you here? What made you come here? Why would an American woman come here?" And I said, "Well, let me tell you a couple of reasons." I said, "I coached high school debate at one point, and during one of the seasons when my team was preparing for the state debate tournament, it was on a foreign relations topic, and the Russians invaded Afghanistan. And we had to adapt the affirmative case as a result of the Russians invading Afghanistan." I said, "So when I think about Afghanistan, I had to learn about Afghanistan because of debate." I said, "So I have followed your country as a result of what I learned about Afghanistan, and I have seen, the changes that have happened since 9/11. And I said, "And the second thing is debate changed my life." So I wouldn't be here if it weren't for debate. I said, "I've been all over the world working on political debates and democracy building projects. And it's all because I was a debater." I said, "So I know the power of debate to change lives." And it was like, okay. And it was like, now let's see how this is going to change your life. But basically, I was well received. One of the presidents of one of the universities had gone to UMKC.
Oh, wow.
And he, I walk in, most people didn't know where Kansas was. That was probably the first thing, like, where in the world are you from? So, I'd have a map and I'd show them. But I walked in and he asked me something about Lawrence. And I said, "How do you know Lawrence?" He said, "Well, I came to the U.S. when my parents were graduate students." And then he said, "I went to UMKC." And so we talked Kansas City, we talked Lawrence, he'd been here. And unfortunately, because he started not only a small university, but he started a K-12 school that let girls study. When Kabul was taken over, he was killed.
Oh.
Yeah. And that one really hit me hard. So, yeah.
And it was because he was like part of that
Because
administration?
he was promoting women's education, and he'd been educated in the U.S. And yeah,
Wow.
so he was killed. Yeah, so it was an interesting experience. I think one of the memories I have, and I didn't tell my family about this until maybe after the second or third trip, but on my first trip, I stayed in a safe house. So there were a lot of non-Afghans who worked for the NGO that I was involved with, and we all stayed in a safe house. Had steel doors. We had bars on the windows. We had 2 panic rooms that we could go to, one on one floor, one on another. There was a steel door at the bottom of the stairway going up to the bedrooms. It was a beautiful house. In fact, when I walked in, it looked like some of the houses that were described in Kite Runner.
Mm-hmm.
So it was the wealthy part
Mm-hmm.
of Kabul back, in the 50s and 40s, and beautiful house. And we had somebody who cooked and everything. But there were armed guards out there all the time. There was a huge wall, and there was, razor tape on the top of it. And so I got there, and we had a security person who was head of security for the NGO, and he told me, he said, go up and get settled in, unpack, kind of get a sense of the building, and then you need to meet me in my office. So I did that. I walk into his office, and he hands me a white, kind of large envelope, and it has my name on it. And he said, open it up. And I pulled out a sheet of paper, and the only thing on it was my name and 1, 2, 3. And he said, this is your proof of life document. He said, if you are kidnapped and held, we will use this to find out if you're alive or not.
Oh, wow.
He said, so what I need you to do is write 3 questions about yourself that nobody can Google, nobody will find online, and then the answers. And then once you have done that, put it in, seal it, and we're going to go walk over to the safe and put it in. So I had to think of things that were not on Facebook, were not in any of my social media, wouldn't be in any interview I'd ever done. And so they were little things like, the color of my house or that kind of thing. And that's what I put in that form. And this was my proof of life document.
Wow.
And my first thought was, you're not in Kansas anymore. I mean, I actually thought that.
Mm-hmm.
But I knew it was a serious thing. And over the 3.5 years, there was a grocery store, because once they found out I had Italian roots and I knew how to cook Italian food, some of the Afghan men had been, in Europe, and they'd been places, and they loved Italian food. And so they asked me when I came back if I would cook some Italian food for them. And then I had them teach me Afghan food. So I know a lot of really good Afghan recipes. And so when I came back the second time, there was a grocery store we went to, and it was where all the expats, so there was like food the British would have had, Marmite and all that stuff, and you'd have, Asian foods and all of this. And it's where I'd pick up spaghetti and, other stuff, and tomato sauce. And so I made a couple Italian dishes. And but after one of my trips, that grocery store was bombed.
Wow.
And it was bombed on a Friday because the only people who would have been out would have been expats, because everybody else was at mosque on Friday morning. We did not work on Friday. Friday was the day off, because this was when everyone went, went to the mosque to pray. And they knew it was an expat place. And so when I went back like 6 months later, the security to get into that grocery store was unbelievable.
And how far is this, like, from where you're staying at?
It was not too far, probably, a couple miles, because the expats tended to live in the same area. They were in this safe area. And there was a guard. Somebody could have easily run through the gate and killed the guard to get into where we all lived. But it was where the journalists stayed. It was where a lot of the NGOs stayed. And so the area we were in was really all expats. And like I said, you felt pretty safe. But there was a restaurant close to where I stayed that we would drive by every day. And after another trip, not too long after it, there would be like a door with a peephole. It was like the old speakeasy thing. And somebody would let people in. Mm-hmm. And what they did was when the door was open, when that little thing was open, they stuck a gun in and shot everybody.
Oh, wow.
And then broke in and killed a bunch of people in the restaurant. So there were places I had been where, there was terrorism. And on my last trip, because it was the last one before our grant ended, the day after I got there, there was a bombing near the U.S. Embassy, and I always had to go to the embassy. I would get body armor and a helmet. They'd issue that to me and give me all sorts of safety things. And, it was close to the U.S. Embassy, but there was a member of parliament who was going down that street, and they were trying to kill that member of parliament because he was, friend of the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
So that happened first morning I was there. And then my birthday was during that trip, and I didn't hear it because I had a fan on, but the woman who was staying in the room next to me had her window up,
Mm-hmm.
and she didn't have a fan on. And she heard the gunshots and the bombs, but they tried to kill Karzai. And his palace was a half mile from where I was staying. So those were 2 terrorist acts on my last trip. So it was pretty clear that, Taliban they never went away.
Mm-hmm. And like during these trips, how long are you there for?
It
Like each
depends.
trip?
Yeah, they were each a different length of time. I think by the time you put the 5 trips together, I probably spent close to 3 months.
3 months each trip?
No, that was when you
Oh,
put
in
them all
total?
together. First one was
Okay.
the longest. I think I was there 3 or 3.5 weeks. Most of the others, it was a couple weeks at a time. So, yeah.
And was the goal always the same every time you went?
Yeah, the first couple times it was to get the program up and running, teach them all about, how to do British parliamentary debate, get the teachers prepared, set up all of the mechanisms for how they would practice and everything. And then we started having tournaments. And so I went back one time for just a city tournament. And then after we expanded to the rest of the country, then we had national tournaments. And we had our last national tournament at American University of Afghanistan. And the woman who helped start that went to KU.
Really?
Yeah.
Whoa.
Her name is Leslie. God, why have I just forgotten? Anyway, she helped start it, and she is still involved. They've had to move the university to another country after. But we had our national tournament there, and not long after we had the national tournament there, they kidnapped 2 of the faculty from that university, and they were held for a couple of years.
Oh, wow.
Eventually released. And then several months after that, there was a big courtyard at American University of Afghanistan, and there was a building next to it, and the Taliban took over that building and then rappelled into the courtyard and killed something like 30 students and faculty, killed, injured, and it shut the university down for quite a while. So, anytime you would go into one of these universities, they were checking under our car for bombs, all of the procedures were just incredible, the security procedures. And there were times when we had to change the route we were taking to go somewhere. The NGO was in contact with the U.S. Embassy all the time, and they were telling us, any chatter they had picked up, and especially on that last trip when there'd been so much activity going on. Security was really high. But, I didn't think about it. I was aware, because you have to be aware. But I didn't dwell on it because, I'd been in New York with family, and a couple weeks later, there was some bombing, on a street in New York that I had walked past. You think about the Las Vegas attack. We have that here all the time. We have, mass murders all the time here. And if you worry about it here, because you never know, they're random. So that was kind of how I approached it, was that, are you really completely safe anywhere? And if you let that get in your way, would you ever leave your house? And then you could trip on something or fall down the stairs. So it's not how I live my life. And I guess I am a risk taker, but it's made for an interesting life.
And from the first time that you went to Afghanistan to start that program to the last day, like how big of a difference did you see in like how they debate and how they like talk about politics in their country?
Huge, huge difference, especially with the women. The first time I went, there were very few burqas when I went, because once the Taliban went away, most of the women gave up the burqas. The first time I went, most of the women who wore burqas were women who were begging. They were widows, and they didn't want anybody to see, or they were married to very traditional men who had them in burqas walking behind them, but very, very few. And in fact, there was a women's cooperative store that I would shop at where they made lovely clothing. And they had taken burqas and made purses. So I brought back a bunch of purses that had been made out of burqa fabric. And I thought that was just a great, kind of metaphor for what they were doing. And so the women who weren't in burqas, of course, had hijab on. And they had very tailored jackets, long skirts, very heavy fabrics. And that's kind of what I wore the first time. But by my last trip, the young women especially, and a third of the women a third of the students were women in my program. And at this point, women were going to college. About a third nationally were women. They were studying everything. Little girls were in school. They were building elementary schools. They were building high schools because a lot of kids had never gone past elementary school. I mean, schools were just burgeoning. And so I began seeing where they were wearing leggings in place of slacks. They were wearing sleeveless sundresses with a long sleeve tee under it that, kind of brushed the knees. And that was appropriate because you have to cover your rear. And sandals, painted toenails, fingernails, and very thin scarves. And a lot of jewelry. So I saw this change over time, especially with the younger women. And in fact, the woman who worked for the NGO, who stayed in the room next to me at the house, she said she wished she had bought stock in the leggings industry before Afghan women discovered them. But yeah, I saw changes, and then just, more women. There were women driving cars by the last time I was there. Like I said, lots more little girls out going to school, and women in parliament. In fact, at one of our debates, not our last one, but the next to the last one, a woman parliamentarian was one of the judges of the final round, along with a couple ambassadors. So it was, I saw change, huge change, and that's why it was heartbreaking in 2021.
And I know you mentioned earlier that you got to sit in a room with Lady Bird Johnson.
Yeah.
Was she the first lady that you actually met, or who was it?
Hillary Clinton was the first lady I'd met. And I met her before she was first lady, and then during the time. I have met Hillary Clinton on many occasions, had tea with her at the White House one day. Lady Bird was the second, and like I said, I had 2 hours of a lunch with her in her apartment. And that came about because I also taught a course at KU, as like I said, I went into politics, and I talked about the suffrage movement and women's rights. And they had, for the 75th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, they had an exhibit on women's rights that was touring the country. And I had a chance to look at it and make some suggestions. And the man who was the head of the LBJ library at the time was from Kansas. And he knew I had been involved. My name wasn't anywhere, but he knew, background that I had done some input into that exhibit. And it was at the LBJ library at the time. So he contacted me because I was going to be in Texas for a conference in San Antonio. And it was the only place I could get to see it. And he said, "Do you want to come and see it?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Bring some of your students, some of your colleagues, if you want to come." And I said, "Sure." So one of the women faculty members and her father, who taught at Mizzou, and then one of my graduate students and I went over. And he said, "I might have a surprise for you. We'll see, but we'll do a tour." So we got a personal tour of the museum, the library. And when we got here, he said, "Well, we're now going to go to lunch. Mrs. Johnson's here."
Oh, wow.
And she was just delightful, unpretentious. And she talked about how, and I wrote about this in an article that I had written for another book on Lady Bird. I did the biography of Lady Bird for a book on modern first ladies. And I had written about the fact that she was terrified of public speaking. And she personally sabotaged her high school GPA so that she wouldn't have to do a valedictorian speech. Got some B's so that she wouldn't have the top grade. And then she finally took a speech class when LBJ was a senator and got over her fear, and then she gave hundreds of speeches. But she talked about that. It's like, I'm sitting here with all these people who teach communication and public speaking, and she talked about how she overcame her fear. So I've met her. I've met Hillary. I met Rosalind Carter when she spoke in Topeka at the Menninger Foundation. I met Betty Ford at a dinner in D.C.
Oh, wow.
I had 3 or 4 times I've met Jill Biden. And who else? It seems like I'm leaving somebody out. But anyway, I've met at least 5 of them.
And I know you did Joe Biden did a forward for one of your books, right?
Yes.
What was that experience like?
Okay.
Like, because I know you said like you didn't think like she was gonna be able to do it because of all like the
Yeah,
loopholes
they're
and
worried
stuff.
about. Yeah. She did do the foreword for the textbook, and she gave us an interview. And that was a result of, she's now written about it in her biography, so I can talk about it. And also somebody talked to another reporter, and so it got out. But I was in the spring of 2022. 6 of us were invited to the White House for tea with Dr. Biden. And she wanted us to honestly assess how she'd done in the first year and help her plan what she was going to do for the remainder of the term. And she found out about this association we've started called FLAIR, First Ladies Association for Research and Education. We had just launched it about not even a year before. And we talked about FLAIR and what we were doing to promote First Ladies, because several of us were there who were involved with FLAIR. In fact, our sitting president was there. And we spent 2 hours with her over tea, and we walked out to see Michelle Obama's kitchen garden and the beehives and everything. And but it was an off the record. So one of the women said, "Can I show pictures to my grandchildren? Can I post this on Facebook?" No, this is an off the record meeting. But then, like I said, somebody told about it. And what was interesting, it was in Katie Rogers' book. She had errors. She had somebody there who wasn't there, and she didn't have somebody there who was there.
Oh, okay.
And the way the meeting was described was not like any of us remembered. I mean, some of it was, but it's like, we never talked about that. So it was kind of a weird, interpretation. But as a result of that meeting and her finding out about FLAIR and that what we were doing, because Anita McBride was at that meeting too, and she, having been a First Lady staff member, she knew a lot of Dr. Biden's staff members and told them that we were writing the book and asked, and that was how we got her. And she was very eager as a teacher to do it for a college textbook. And then she gave us a 45-minute interview, and the book quotes that interview pretty liberally. Yeah. So that was a great experience.
Yeah.
And then and then she came to a conference that FLAIR jointly sponsored at the Ford Library for the 40th anniversary of Betty Ford and Rosalind Carter having the very first conference about First Ladies and their roles in 1984. And Dr. Gould from Texas was the keynote speaker. And so we did a 40th anniversary, and Dr. Biden was the keynote speaker, except she had no voice. So she brought somebody along to read her speech, and she sat there while they read it. So, and then in the fall of 2024, I was invited to a dinner at the White House that the Bidens hosted, because she had redone the public tour of the East Wing, which is no longer there, of course. And because there were a lot of educators she invited, because she had redone this as an educator, thinking about, because when you do a tour of the White House, when you do the public tour, nobody guides it, it's self-guided. And there had not been any, information about the room, any history of the room, what was there. You just kind of had to figure it out, and there was nobody to tell you. So she did, the content, and she had video. She had, in the room where FDR did his fireside chats, they had a radio from that time period, and they had tapes playing of him so you could hear the fireside chats. And she had like casts made of some of the mantle, the really fancy mantles that you could touch. So kids who were tactile, so they were all, doorknobs, they had replicas. So it was just an incredible exhibit. And she'd invited, of course, people who had funded it, corporations, and then she invited a lot of educators, and I was invited to it and got to do the tour. And I took my stepdaughter, who has her degree in museum studies from KU and does public education. And she had just been on the tour with her two kids a few months before. And she was like, they don't have anything to read.
Mm-hmm.
So she was just, excited to see the change from what she'd seen about 4 months earlier. Yeah.
And I know you mentioned earlier that there's a couple first ladies who wrote scripts for the president's debate or
Some of their speeches.
from their speeches.
Yeah.
So how like what's that process like? Like, are they able to say like whatever they want on the speech, or who does it have to go through?
Oh, well, it kind of depended on the time period and the whole system. So one of the first ladies who had input into speeches was Sarah Polk. James Polk was a one-term president, very successful, ran on 4 issues, accomplished them all. He was never very healthy. They had no children, so his career was her child. And she was very political. She grew up in a political family at a time when most women weren't supposed to be political, but she was very savvy. And she helped write a lot of his speeches. But this was at a time when you didn't have the staffs. This is in the 1840s.
Mm-hmm.
So you didn't have huge staffs. And, there were cabinet members and you had personal staff as a president, but it wasn't the way the West Wing didn't exist at the time. President's office was in the living quarters.
Oh, wow.
And what's now the Lincoln bedroom was typically the cabinet room.
Okay.
And then their bedrooms were down the hall. And that's another whole story in Edith Roosevelt, who got the West Wing built. But Sarah Polk did a lot of that. And she read a bunch of newspapers every morning and summarized them for him. So that would have been one where, the presidents pretty much, they might call in a cabinet member or a friend, but they did a lot of that themselves. And they didn't give that many speeches back then.
Mm-hmm.
Very few. Now you have speech writing teams, but Hillary Clinton was very involved in the editing. And there were several magazine articles about like his first State of the Union address and how it had been put together and that she was in. So she would have been part of a team with some input. And Lady Bird reviewed some of his speeches, and she would critique his speeches and grade them. And there's a wonderful audio tape of her calling him after one of his news conferences. You should look it up, Lady Bird Critique News Conference. It's funny because she took shorthand. And when I wrote a book chapter about her, I learned shorthand in high school, and I could read all of her shorthand notes we'd gotten them out of the archives. And then she has her shorthand notes, and she's reading off of them to him. And when she's finished, and you could tell she'd taken a public speaking class because it sounded exactly like somebody would have critiqued a Speech 101 class. And when he was finished, he goes, well, how do you think I did? She goes, well, it was a solid B+.
Mm-hmm.
I said, well, I thought it was better than that. And she goes, and then she changed the subject to, well, so-and-so's coming over for dinner tonight. But, she would give advice. And I'm sure, Eleanor probably had some input. So a lot of it was informal. And I think Florence Harding probably had some input into some of the speeches. Helen Taft did. But it was, like I said, back when you didn't have this formal office of speech writing. And now I think it would be much more difficult. Once again, it goes back to the marriage and how close they are as advisors. Yeah.
And how do you think the first lady's role now has changed now with like the media, like digital, like social media and all that stuff? Like you kind of don't really hear from them that much. Like especially with Melania Trump, you really don't hear from her.
Well, she's doing a lot though. There's this misperception that she's not doing anything, but it's kind of like the Pat Nixon situation. Pat Nixon went to like 70 countries and often by herself and just did all this amazing diplomacy, but it didn't get reported very broadly. And even Jill Biden, when we were writing the chapter here, we were digging through newspapers and we found the local media where she would visit covered it, but it wasn't making much of the national media. And part of the reason is that there is no one specifically assigned to cover the First Lady. It's catch as catch can.
Okay.
And so she doesn't have her own news team to follow, journalist team to follow her around. So they all do more than the public is ever aware of. And probably every First Lady we talk about in the book, people are going to be shocked at some of the things they do. Bess Truman, for example, and Mamie Eisenhower, people didn't think they did anything wrong. When you can get into the archives and, you need time, and over time people will see. But, Melania at the Inauguration Day luncheon was sitting next to Senator Klobuchar, who's a Democrat. And because they have both a Democrat and a Republican from the Senate who manage it, and she was the Democrat. And there was an act that was stalled in the Senate. It had been passed in the House called the Take It Down Act. And it was revenge porn.
Oh, wow.
And, all of this, about making it illegal to doctor somebody's picture, put somebody's face on another body, do this revenge porn stuff. And it was stuck. And because Melania took children as her issue, Be Best, in her first term, Senator Klobuchar asked her if she would work with her and Senator Cruz. So this was bipartisan on getting this act restarted in the Senate. And a few weeks after the inauguration, Mrs. Trump went to Capitol Hill and had a listening session with senators and brought in young women who had been damaged by this. They passed the act, and Melania was there when he signed it. And they've already prosecuted some people. So she was instrumental in getting a major piece of legislation through, working behind the scenes. And that got some attention. But Fostering the Future, she's doing so much for foster children, and something just came out. But once again, it probably doesn't get into your local newspaper. So unless she's there, so here's the problem. The local press covers them where they are, and often the national media doesn't follow them around. If they do something in Washington, it's the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Hill, things that the average American doesn't read that's covering it. And so because I'm a junkie and I read, multiple news sources every day, and I'm doing it to track it down, I know about this. But even my students I teach a course for American University, which I'll be teaching in 3 weeks, using our textbook. Last year, they didn't know about the Take It Down Act because you know how college students are. They don't read papers.
Yeah.
They don't have time for that. So they were shocked at everything she was doing. And they're in the middle of Washington, D.C., and they were political science majors. So part of it's the way the media does not cover them. And but as far as it's changed, the role hasn't really changed since Martha Washington. They're still expected to be a hostess. They're still expected, as Martha was, to be kind of a private consultant to her husband to look out for their welfare. But every First Lady gets to define the job because there's no legal requirement that they have to do anything. There's no constitutional mention. There's no rule book. You aren't handed something saying, here's what a First Lady needs to do. A president has a constitution to follow and, 200 and some years of precedent. But the First Ladies kind of choose. And we've had some First Ladies who've said, I'm not well. I'm not doing anything. I don't like the spotlight, like Bess Truman. But Bess was doing all these things behind the scene. And like I said, once you get time and archives open, you begin to see some things that you wouldn't have seen at the time. And I think that's what's happened with Mrs. Trump, because even during the pandemic, she was making public service announcements about wearing masks. They're online. She was posting things on what was Twitter at the time, of games for kids to play, educational games for kids to do at home. And she was doing all of these things, but nobody was talking about it. And unless you're researching the way I research and my co-authors, you're not going to find a lot of this now. There is, however, a publication, and the woman who started it 2 years ago now had actually worked at Kansas City Star at one time, Jennifer Taylor. She started an online magazine called the East Wing Magazine, EWM. And she interviews people like me who are writing books and studying, and any new book that comes out or anything that's documentary or anything. She's interviewing people. And in fact, she will be interviewing an artist who has become interested in First Ladies on Thursday night at 6 o'clock Central Time about his work and his artwork on the White House and First Ladies. And she'd written an article about him for East Week Magazine, and we've picked him up with our Flair account, and he will be doing one of our virtual programs. But she summarizes a lot of what's in other newspapers. So you subscribe to it. It's a Substack. And that's kind of, and she did it because as a reporter, she knew they weren't getting covered. So East Wing Magazine, it's a great little publication.
And kind of to end it off on this one, how would you think the roles would be reversed? Like if there was a first gentleman?
Yeah. I actually did a podcast about that. Our Flair organization has a podcast called American FLOTUS.
Okay.
POTUS, President of the United States, FLOTUS, First Lady of the United States. So the very first American FLOTUS podcast was in 2024 before the election, and I was asked what I thought would happen when we had the first woman president. And essentially what I said is I don't think anything will change. If you look at Doug Emhoff as second gentleman, he basically did what most second ladies do. They take their cues from the first lady. If the first lady wants them around, they follow them. They do some projects. So he and Jill Biden traveled together. And when he was interviewed, what he said was what was said going back to Martha Washington. My first job, my first concern is to take care of my husband and support what he is doing. And he was asked, and he said, my first responsibility is to support my wife and what she's doing as vice president. Those were his words. And that was what he did. And he had an issue. He took on anti-Semitism and did some things with the committee on that. And like I said, he traveled with Dr. Biden some of the time, but he had a job. And I think, Dr. Biden broke the mold, and she had an outside the White House job taught. And, I think that she made it possible for the first gentleman to work outside the White House because Mr. Emhoff worked at Georgetown, taught at the law school. So I think when we do have a woman president, I think the first gentleman, or whatever he wants to call himself, will have some type of a paid position outside. But it's going to have to be really careful. And like with Dr. Biden, it was private money that paid for her teaching position. It was not any kind of state money.
Mm-hmm.
And because you've got to be careful because of federal money going into colleges, universities. And Emhoff was at a private university, Georgetown, and he was paid with private funds also. So it'll have to be really careful what they do. And there was a one-season show called Commander-in-Chief. And it only lasted one season.
Mm-hmm.
But her poor husband couldn't figure out what to do. And that was a large part of the show. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, besides your book here, Remember the First Ladies, could you tell us about the new book that you're working on, or maybe just a little bit?
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you can release the details on that.
Yeah, this is a book that a friend of mine, Myra Gooden, who was the very first president of Flair, and she's been battling getting attention for First Ladies since she started her doctorate at the University of Michigan. And she interviewed Betty Ford for her dissertation and went out to Colorado during the summer and interviewed her. And so she'd been wanting to write this biography of Betty Ford, and she started on it in 2014, and then there were a lot of family things that kept getting pushed to the side. So she's ready to finish it now. And there have been a lot of new papers opened, and she decided she needed a co-author, and so she asked me if I would join her. And she was just here a few weeks ago, and we worked for a week. So it's for the University Press of Kansas for their series on modern First Ladies. And it's really looking, Betty Ford was First Lady for 2.5 years. But what she did after that was significant because of the Betty Ford Center. She and Rosalind Carter teamed up and went up to the Hill to testify, and they were quite a duo. And if you stop and think about it, Carter beat Ford, but yet the four of them became best friends. Mm-hmm. And Gerald Ford left a eulogy to be read that his son read when Jimmy Carter died.
Oh, wow.
Because Ford preceded, and Carter gave a eulogy. Rosalind Carter gave a eulogy. So one of the things we're talking about in the book that other biographies haven't talked about is this notion of what we call the First Lady Sisterhood. How once it's a small, some people call it the sorority, we call it the sisterhood. Very few women have had that role, just like very few men have been presidents, and they tend to get along after they've all are out of office. And so we have a whole chapter looking at her relationship with Rosalind Carter and with other first ladies. She and Betty and Mamie Eisenhower were really close. And Mamie we found letters when I was up in Michigan researching to Betty when Betty had breast cancer. So we're really looking at this notion of the sisterhood and the support of one another. And Mrs. Ford and Mrs. Carter went to the Hill when Hillary Clinton was trying to get health care to support what she was doing. So it's, and when one first lady passes, you will have the living first ladies all talking about how she had helped her when she was in the position. So we're really kind of looking into that and using how Betty Ford worked with so many of the other women, and she and Lady Bird were really close. So that's a little different, but we're really looking at a lot of what she did afterwards, and how her young life prepared her, and that she really didn't change when she became First Lady, that she went back to what she had really been as a young woman, independent, outspoken, breaking the mold. So hopefully it will be finished at the first of the year and then take another 6 months or so to come out.
And when it does come out, where could the people find the book on?
University Press of Kansas, it'll be on their website.
Okay.
Yeah. So hopefully, sometime before 2027 is over, it'll probably hopefully be out in about a year from now.
And are there any other projects that you're working on right now besides the book that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I have another exciting project, which we haven't gone public with yet, but it's for kids' books. And I'm not actually writing, but I'm working with a company that's doing kids' books about First Ladies. So I'm excited. And we're going to be making an announcement about that probably early September.
Okay, coming up then.
That's coming up, yeah. More news.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to tell us a little bit about your work and, your life researching First Ladies, Diana. So.
Oh, well, this has absolutely been a pleasure. And like you can tell, I love talking about this. And I think it's important for us to know this history.
I think it is, because not a lot of us actually know what goes on behind the scenes. We pretty much just focus on the president and we kind of forget about the First Lady.
Yeah.
So you bring in their work up to the forefront, I think is really important, because we actually see that they actually do impact a lot of the decisions that presidents make, or they even themselves go and take the next step and create legislation to be passed.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you so much for giving me an opportunity. And I want to thank Alejandra for introducing us.
I know.
So thank you. And good luck with your podcast.
Yeah, I'm excited. And I'm excited for all the new work that you're going to be doing coming up.
I'm excited for yours. I'm going to be listening, and good luck.
Thank you.
You're a good interviewer.
Thank you.